it's nice to see people in the audience that want to listen to what you have to say. I came out here, I guess, about 6 or 7 years ago. They wanted me to do a program. And they said, why don't you go down to the Camellia garden and we'll send everybody down there so you can talk to them. And I had one lady that came down there, but she wasn't quite sure whether she wanted to hear me talk or whether she wanted to go see the pony rides. And she ended up opting for the pony rides, and so I went home. So anyway, it's nice to have everybody here. Mike, would you start these on this side here and just pass these around? I'm sorry, Diane. That's some copies that Gail made for us of an article that she had read in a 1965 American Camellia Journal yearbook, about how to root camellias in a barrel. Because there's a lot of different ways that you can do this. What I'm going to tell you today is based upon my experience, but there's a lot of different ways. Never let anybody tell you that you can't do something a certain way, because there's a lot of ways to do it. Sometimes people would wonder why a nurseryman would come in here and tell everybody all about how to root camellias. I mean, you guys are going to learn how to root them, so you're going to all open nurseries and put me out of business, right?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. I'm going to be upset if you do. And then there's the other thing, that if you tell people how to root camellias, then they're not going to buy your plants, because they know how to root them themselves. We want you to know how to root them, but you don't have the cuttings that I have, so you're still going to have to buy the plants. But if you're excited about rooting them, you're probably going to buy more in the long run. Because back in the old days, that's what people did. Everybody knew how to root. Everybody knew how to graft. Everybody knew how to air labor. Everybody knew how to jib. People were excited. And that's our objective, is to create excitement. So it's not just about propagating plants, it's about propagating our heritage. So that in 30 years from now, there'll be another generation of people in here that still have this same kind of excitement and interest that we have. I had a lot of people that helped me along the way. Ray Bailey, Scotty Forbes, Gus DeBuse, I could just go on and on and on. They gave of themselves, and so I think it's my time to give back on some of that as well. Now, we're going to start out today talking about cuttings, and then we're going to talk about seed. And they're two entirely different animals. How many people in here have successfully rooted camellias that are already, okay? All right, we have some people that already are ahead of the game. You do know that one of you next year will do this same program. So, I saw you raise your hand. I'm making notes in here. I've been rooting plants since I was a kid. My dad was a disabled veteran, and he had a little small nursery. It wasn't the bigger nursery that you see when you come in my place now. It was actually in the very back of where we're at. My grandparents lived up in the front, and so you would drive up a different driveway, you would drive around the back, and then you'd blow your horn for service. And if Daddy wasn't able to go out, then the little 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 10-year-old, whatever red-headed kid would come out and help you. So, I learned it by doing. But what Daddy would do is he had a little rooting house. When I was little, it seemed really big, but when I think about it, it was only 12 by 20 feet. It was a small building, but that's where he rooted his stuff in. When I was a kid, you didn't buy your groceries, around the corner out on Whitfield Avenue. You had to go downtown because they didn't have grocery stores out there. I remember going up Waters Avenue and there were horses and cows, over on the side. I thought it was really cool. But we always went to the AMP grocery store that was down on Abercorn, just past Victory Drive. Anybody remember that?
Yes.
Okay, great. They had the coffee. You could grind your own coffee, 8 o'clock coffee. But the real reason we went down there was because of Earl Denmark. Earl Denmark was the manager of the AMP, and he was my daddy's uncle. And my daddy was his favorite nephew. And And when they would get produce in, they didn't come in cardboard boxes, they came in wood boxes. So Uncle Earl would save all the wood boxes for my daddy. And so Daddy would take in this 20 by 12 house, he had benches, about like tables, and he would take these produce wood boxes and set them on the benches, and he would put his rooting medium into these boxes, and that is how he rooted his azaleas and his camellias. And so, you know, that's how we ended up getting started with that whole deal. He used coarse sand and peat moss. Now, there's a difference between coarse sand and place sand. You can see place sand a lot of times. It's a real fine sand. Coarse sand is kind of like your building sand. If you're building a house, that's what you would get. Maxwell Beatty sells it at Beatty Sand over on Chatham Parkway. So if you need like 5 yards of it, they can send you a dump truck load of it. If you need a little bit more, you can come over and see me like a bucket, and I'll send you to the pile. We do keep it covered because I have cats in there. And what Daddy would do is he would go around in people's trash. You know, they sit on the side of the roads. When they had their windows reworked and they'd have old screens they're throwing out, he'd go get them. And he would take these frames and he would mount them up over his boxes, and then he would put plastic over it. So he created like a little terrarium, like a little humidity environment. And so a lot of what we got was all based on what we could get that didn't cost us anything, because he was poor and we were poor. I didn't know it at the time, but I'm still poor. And there was Miss Annie at the Hess School that would save us the tin cans, and then when we would root them, we'd put them in tin cans. And then when people would come in to buy them, it was easy going in, but they couldn't pull them out. So we had these things called can cutters. And we'd cut the can on each side. And then we'd put it in their car. When they get home, all they got to do is open it up. You know what OSHA would do to us today if we had can cutters? I mean, really. It's just... so I think that if Daddy were back today, he would be truly amazed at what we've done that is different. At our nursery, we literally root tens of thousands of camellias every year. You know, last month Debbie talked about tea, and she keeps telling me next week is I got to start sticking tea cuttings in. You know, and she's talking probably 10,000 just tea cuttings, not just the ornamental. So we root a lot of them. Some of them are going to be easy to root, and some of them are going to be more difficult. How many people know about the retic hybrid called Frank Hauser? Okay. I knew Jan was going to raise her hand. I know her mom tells me how much she loves it and hers looks. Certain ones like Frank Hauser are more difficult to root. And then there's ones like the Camellia azalea, the one that's blooming in the Camellia garden. If you've been down there and seen that plant. Oh, it'll root, but then it dies within about a year. It doesn't hardly grow any. It won't grow on its own roots. So you have all these little factors that you have to play into it. When we root our plants, we're using a little different media than what Daddy used. Daddy would take coarse sand and peat moss and he'd mix them half and half and he'd put them in these boxes. Can you still do that? Yes. You can still do what Daddy did. You can still use bark and sand, peat moss and sand, and you can root these plants with no problem. But what we found is today, if you use pine bark mulch, that's the fine grade stuff. And it's probably sitting right in front of me. Yes, it is, I think. I have to look in the canister because it's, yes. The mulch is going to be the finer stuff. Now you can buy that at Lowe's, you can buy it at Home Depot, you can buy it at the garden centers like Herb Creek and Hester and Zipper, and probably anywhere that sells all of that stuff. But it's mulch. Always remember mulch. It's going to be a fine stuff. You don't want things like the mini nuggets, which is going to be more of a medium grade. It's bigger chunks. You want the finer stuff. And then you need something called perlite. It's like this. So perlite's the same as vermiculite, right? Wrong. They're two entirely different animals. This is going to help you to get better drainage. whereas vermiculite is going to tend to help to hold more water, but they look a lot alike when you see them. So perlite and mulch, mix them half and half together, and you have the secret for rooting camellias the way that we do it. Now you might come up with a different medium, and that's okay too, but that's what we use right here to root our plants. Now what do you root them in? You can root them in all kinds of things. You could try the barrel method that Gail, I read that article, Gail, it was a good article, I forgot about it, but I remember reading it years ago. You could have a little bed that you made out of concrete blocks that you put whatever your medium is in there. And then you could cover it with some plastic in some way. We happen to have shade houses and greenhouses. But if you don't happen to have a shade house and a greenhouse, and you say, well, how am I going to keep it moist? You can get you a greenhouse. It's called a storage box. You know, you can get them just about any place that you want to. You can buy them online. You can go to the store and get them. When you open the top, you can sit your pot, your tray, whatever it is that you want to put in here with your cuttings, and then you close the lid and you have a greenhouse now. You have something very similar to what my daddy used to do with the frames and the plastic. It's just to keep the moisture in so that those cuttings do not dry out until they have actually put roots on them. So,
how about aeration?
Aeration?
Do you need air in there, or just keep it closed up?
You can keep it closed up. That's one option that you have. There's another option that you have, is that when you stick your cuttings in your trays or your pots, if you put them in a shady location outside, especially now while it's warm, and you water them maybe once a day or once every other day, keep it moist in there, they probably will root just as quick that way. So you don't necessarily have to do it this way. When I was a little kid, I made this thing after Daddy had died. I thought it was like a tent, you know, and I would go in there and put cuttings in. I actually went into the tent to put the cuttings, and during the summer it would get to 130 degrees in there. You know, so I had to leave the vent open a little bit. I guess I would have suffocated if I did. But I think that excessive temperature sometimes, it maybe works against you. You don't want it to be where it's really cold that you're doing them wide open outside, but as long as it's warm, it's fine. If we were to move into this fall, you wanted to stick cuttings, I would probably try something where they're covered, just to keep it from getting too cold outside. Now, when Daddy rooted cuttings, he used hormones on them. This is something called Rutone. Anybody ever use Rutone? Okay, you know about Rutone. This box has been around forever and ever. This was actually Judge Solomon's Rutone that Jan gave me, so I kept it. And I said, hey, you know, I can't find any Rutone. It's $1.98. Okay, I think I bought what is this called? This is called Bontone. And this was like $6, so it's gone up a little bit in the days since Judge Solomon was here. But he used the powdered Rutone to stick on his cuttings, and he would put them in there. And you can do that today too, but there's a better way. The better way is, for me, is going to be a liquid hormone called Dip and Grow. And you're probably not going to find this at a local garden center or a place where you can buy it. You're going to probably have to buy it online. They do sell it from the Dip and Grow website. Now, you don't have to buy a whole big bottle like this if you're just rooting a few cuttings. They have a smaller bottle that's less expensive that you can order. Now, we mix our hormone with something else they sell called dip gel. This was originally made in the food industry. And when you mix this with water, it makes it into a kind of a slippery, slurry type thing. If your kids ever like to play slip and slide, this would be the thing to put on there because it would go. But what it does is it keeps the end of the cutting from drying out so quick, and when you mix it with the rooting hormone, it gives that cutting more time to absorb more hormone, so it's going to help your cuttings to root a little bit quicker. That's the key. We will root our cuttings from anywhere from around the end of June all the way until right before they start growing in the spring. A lot of people say, no, you have to root it in the summer, you have to root it in July, you have to root it in August. You know, that's ridiculous. You can root them anytime that you want during those time frames right there. So if we have a cutting that we want to take, what kind of a cutting do you want to have? Well, I've got a plant up here. Imagine that. This is one of the plants that came from the nursery, and it'll show you a couple of different things. Notice that the cutting, this part right here on the tip, is kind of a reddish color. It's still tender. It's still a little bit what we call rubbery. So if we're going to take a cutting, rather than take that, we would probably want to come down a little bit further. Ideally, you want something that is the past year's wood that grew, or maybe the one before that, if you can get it. But sometimes if you're trying to propagate plants from an old garden, you don't have the luxury of getting really nice growth because the plants haven't put out a lot of growth. But ideally what I would do is come in here and take a cutting like that. So each one of the leaves has a growth bud in it, and we call it an eye, okay? There's one eye, there's two eyes, there's three eyes, and then at the top you've got a fourth eye plus a terminal bud in here. But we probably count these two as one. So if we were going to take a one-eye cutting, we would basically come down and we would root this little teeny weeny tiny piece right here. And what that means is, on this plant, I could get an awful lot of teeny weeny little tiny cuttings. Whereas if I want to have a lot of bigger cuttings, I don't have as many to choose from. So if you don't have a lot of choices for bigger cuttings, you can come in and do the small ones. But you got to have little teeny weeny fingers like me to stick them in. My business partner, Benny's got these big old fingers. He couldn't stick a little cutting if his life depended on it. But then, what do you do in order to prepare this cutting? Is there anything that you need to do? If you're taking these cuttings out at a garden, say you went to somebody's house and you were taking the cuttings, you don't want them to dry out before you get home. And so what we do is you can get a nice little mist bottle, and you can come in here and you can just spray the cuttings and put them in a plastic bag. You can put them in a tub. You know, keep them out of the sun where they don't get too hot until you get home to do it. And if it's a nice hot day, you know, mist yourself too. Sometimes that really works. Now, if you're going to stick this cutting in a pot or a tray, what do you need to do? Well, this is a mixture that we have where we mix the dip gel and the dip and grow. If you don't get the dip gel, just use water. Okay? But the ratio that you're going to mix the hormone to the water or to the dip gel is going to be 1 part dip and grow and 3 parts either water or a water and dip gel solution that you made up. That's it. So people say, well, what kind of parts do we're talking about? Well, if you have 1 teaspoon of dip and grow, you have 3 teaspoons. If you have 1 bucket, yeah, it's just the ratio. There's no, that's all you've got to remember. And it'll tell you on the label that you're having. So what I do is I like to say pimento jars. Pimento jars are ideal for the little thing I measure and mix it all up in. And so I can shake it up to make sure the solution is done, open it up. Now, do I just take this and just dip it in? No. I'm going to do something else. I'm going to wound the cutting. I'm going to scar the cutting. I take a knife. And if you're doing a lot of these, make sure the knife's not too sharp because you're going to cut yourself a lot. You just want to scrape the bottom ½ inch, and I do a double scrape. On each side, I have wounded, I have scraped the cutting. And now I'm going to take it and just dip it in the solution and pull it out. Now you could sit there and hold it for a few seconds. You want to make sure it gets a good dose. And then when you go to the tray, the pot, whatever, you're going to just push it down just enough to cover the cut place. You're not going to bury this thing all the way down into the bottom of that pot. because you want it up close to the top where it can get some oxygen, which is going to help those cut places to heal. The main reason that you're doing that cut is to have a bigger surface area for it to absorb that hormone. That's primarily what you're doing that for. And so usually what will happen is where you did the scrape, it's going to form callus, what we have. And in between the two callus formations is where the roots come out. That's what we end up doing. So in about anywhere from 30 days to 2 months, we should have callus formation and the beginning of the little root hairs coming out of that little cutting, as long as we don't have any problems that go on with it. Now, we grow a lot of ours in these trays. This is an interesting tray. This is a 50-cell tray. They have 72-cell trays. They have a lot of different cell trays. This is cuttings that I stuck in last summer, 50s. And if you count, you'll see that there's 50 cuttings that rooted in here. Now, not all of them are going to be 50 that rooted. Again, some varieties more difficult to root than others. But that's a pretty good feel for where we're at. Now, this past winter, I had some plants on the nursery that just had long suckers on them. And I said, I need to cut them off. So I decided, well, let's try and see how they will root. Okay, so this is 6 months after we stuck the cutting. I'll let you pass it around that way, Mike. Wow. And, you know, always remember that good camellias begin with a good root system. When you see the white feeder roots like that, that's what you want to have. So when you get a plant that's rooted, whether it's in a plug or whether it's in a pot, you know, it's probably going to be more ideal that you then take it and put it in a little bit slightly larger container. So if we were going to pot one of these from last year, I would just pull it out. This is what it looks like when it's in the soil versus when I bare rooted it, so you can see how the roots are. Yes.
This is planted in that mix, that
Yes.
soil mix?
Yes. Yes.
Just washed off?
Yes, I washed it off so you could see it. And I'll tell you what, that perlite sticks to it. It took me a long time just to get that off. I didn't think I was going to do it. But we would put it in a smaller pot, something like this. This is one that was planted maybe 18 months ago from a plug. So this is kind of what we call our smaller plants out at the nursery. And from here, we go to a 2 gallon, whatever, is the medium-sized plants. It's going to be better for you growing them just for your own use to still kind of do the same thing, I would think, is to root them and then be able to put them into a smaller container, let them get established, and then if you wanted to take this size and plant it in your garden, you would probably be okay, unless you have something that would eat it, right, Howard? If you have deer, and Lucy can tell you that too, smaller camellias like this, you know, they destroy, you know. So protect your smaller plants if you have deer until they get bigger. But this would be ideal to plant out. So you can probably do any cutting that you want to do at this point in time, and it would be ideal for doing that. The way that they do with these little small cuttings, the single eye, or what I call micro cuttings, they do a lot of this in the tea industry. We had a guy that's a friend of ours from England, and he's like a consultant to all these tea places. And he has a nursery that he got started in India where they grow 1 million tea plants a year. And they need every single eye in order to do that. That's a lot of work to do that right there. But that's basically all that there is to rooting a camellia. So for those of you that didn't raise your hand earlier, this is not rocket scientist. This is just a basic getting it in the right environment. Don't let it dry out. If you stick these cuttings out into the full sun right now, they're going to burn up. They can't handle that at this time of the year. So fairly simple situation. Anybody got any questions on cuttings? Yes.
When you move it up to the next size pot, what kind of medium do you use?
Oh, I knew you was gonna ask that, Pat. Okay. Don't do what one of my customers did. She came in last week and she said, I got a plant I want to show you. And she brought it back. She had got it from us earlier in the year, and she said, I need to buy another plant because I put this out in the sun and it didn't like it. And I looked at the pot and the stuff that was in the pot. I said, no, it didn't have anything to do with the sun. She had put it in peat moss, Miracle Grow soil that was sopping wet. She said, but I drilled some holes in the bottom. And I looked in the bottom and there was 3 of the smallest drill bit holes that you could see. So once we got the muck out and turned the water in, the water still wouldn't go through the pot. So ideally, for those plants that you do, what we would suggest is the same medium that we grow. Your pine bark mulch, just like we rooted in, the small stuff. Mix that, not with perlite, but mix that with the mini nuggets, the medium-sized bark. That's primarily what you need. Now, where Debbie grows the stuff in Bullitt County, it dries out more than we do along the coast. So she throws a little bit of peat moss in, but just a little bit, and mixes that together. And that is an ideal medium for growing camellias right here. And then for our smaller plants, for the most part, we fertilize with millorganite and liquid fertilizer. That's all we use when they're little. And then when they get bigger, then we'll go up to some of the time release in our bigger containers. Okay, you had a question?
When you put the little plants into the storage box,
Yes.
how long would you leave them in there?
Probably until you can tug on the cutting and feel that it's got resistance. That tells you that there's roots that are down there.
There's roots, okay.
But it's that tug. When you pull on it and it doesn't want to come out, you know you've got something down there holding it right
Okay.
there, in there. Was there another question?
When you scar the cutting, did you remove the cambium layer?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
I was writing too fast.
Okay.
You're rooting, it's one part of the different growth hormone and then 3 parts of the gel.
It's 3 parts water or water mixed with the gel. And if you get the gel, if you buy some of this, it'll tell you how to mix it with the water. So you either do one or the other with it. And one thing I will tell you, if you use this gel and you're mixing it, we mix it in like a pitcher, like a tea pitcher. If you have a whisker, where you basically, you want to keep the water moving while you're dumping this stuff in, or else it'll clog up on you, make these big globs. So you have to keep whisking it while you can mix it. And then we just keep it in the refrigerator, and then once we mix pour it out. We have an outside refrigerator just for stuff like that. Let me clarify. Yeah.
What's the shelf life or refrigerator life of the mixture, the 3 to 1? Until you.
Yeah, really. I don't think it's gonna go, I don't think it'll go bad. We go through a jar or 2 every day when we're mixing it, but other times I've kept it in for months with no problem.
Okay, and one other question, when you remove the cuttings from the tote,
Yes.
we have deer, where would you recommend putting?
I would recommend
A
put
cage or?
a cage.
Okay.
I would put a cage around it, or if you had some area like a courtyard that was fenced off where they can't get to, you have a deck and you think they can't climb up the deck, well, that might be something to think about, but I have seen them climb up the deck too. Any more questions? Yes, ma'am.
What kind of liquid fertilizer do you use?
We use a 20-20-20 that has minor elements in it. And we get it from Site One Landscapes out, on Chatham Parkway, the same people that I was talking about earlier about something that I forgot about right now. But anyway, it's those people. And I think maybe they've changed their name.
They used to be called John Deere Landscape.
Okay, all right, that's gets me confused. They keep changing their name. But you can use that. You could also get a 20-20-20 Jacks or Peters or something like that online, Marcia, that you could get right there. Yes, ma'am.
Do you ever get, when you put them in that box with the top on, and they're moist, and you get a little like mossy growth in there, gray, fungusy looking things, do you need to worry about that?
I haven't never had anything that I needed to worry about, but I won't say that it wouldn't hurt to get a little fungicide if you saw that, something like what they used to call daconil. You can still buy that, but they don't call it daconil anymore. You have to go online to find out the chemical name. You can buy that and spray it, and that will probably stop the problem. And it's not gonna hurt your camellia. Some fungicides might, but that wouldn't.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, John?
How much light, when you have it in something like toast, would it need to root?
It doesn't have to have a lot of light. You know, you might could take it in the house, possibly, but if you keep it outside, I would just have it in a shady spot. So like the light is on the terrace on the back would be fine. Or underneath a tree, you know, that's gonna be shady would be fine. Just not a lot of hot, direct sun that goes through there, right there. All right, have I answered everybody's question on cuttings so I can get to the fun thing? And by the way, Fridays and Saturdays, stop by the nursery. I'll be sticking cuttings for probably the next however many months. So if you want to come over and watch, I'll even let you help. You know? And
Charge you for the lesson.
it depends on how good you are now, Pat. And, you know, if you're real good, I won't charge you. When it comes to seeds, seeds is an entirely different animal. Cuttings, you are creating exact copies, duplicates of the plants. These are clonally produced. But when you're planting camellias from seeds, every single one of them is different from the other. There's going to be slight variations at least, and dramatic variations on many. Japonicas, which is probably the most popular camellia that we have in our area, is self-incompatible. That's according to Dr. Clifford Parks, retired professor of biology. You know, his brain's about this big, so I'm not going to argue with him. He's done tests and studies, and what that means is that if you pollinate a camellia with its own pollen, it's not going to set a seed. It's going to have to be pollinated with pollen from somewhere else. But even if you can pollinate it with its own pollen, it's still going to be slightly variable. It might be a little difference in the plant, it might be a little difference in the flower, it might be just a slight difference, or it could be a big dramatic difference. You just never know what you're going to get. And that's what I like about seeds. It's fun. 99.99% of all our new camellia varieties comes from planting seeds. And they're all over bushes today, so you can go out and get seeds and plant them, and you might have the next great camellia that you can name after yourself, your dog, you know, your neighbor, you know, whatever you want to do. Now, when I was little, and I'm still not that big, I used to go to Dr. Shepard, the pediatrician at the Medical Arts place, and I had something like, I don't know, it was bronchitis, and they had vaporizers. Mike could explain this all to us, but it's boring. So my mom would take me to Dr. Shepard, and while I was in there, Daddy would sit out in the car, and then he saw the gardener at the Medical Arts Center. They didn't have Mo, Blow, and Joe back then, companies that went in, and they had gardeners. So he befriended the gardener at the Medical Arts, and they had sasanquas planted all over, sasanqua camellias. And he asked the gardener, can I come in and get a few seeds? And the gardener said, no, you can come in and get all the seeds. And Daddy did. And he would go in and he'd get the seeds, and then he would take them back home and he would sprout them. Now, he wasn't interested in coming up with some really pretty sasanqua variety. All Daddy wanted was to grow those sasanquas up so he could cut them off and graft something like a japonica or a hybrid or something on it. He wanted rootstock. That was his purpose, but it's still planting seeds that we're talking about today in here. And so you don't ever know what you're going to get. Sometimes you might get something that's incredibly different. One year, my daddy's best friend, Ray Bailey, who was like an uncle to me. When my dad died, I was 15 years old. And I learned a lot from him, but then, you know, there was a lot of stuff I had to take care of, and Ray would come over every week and teach me things and help me do things. Well, we had a friend that lived on Waters Avenue, and they had a little small nursery. And John and I were talking about that earlier, the kind of nursery where you make enough money to pay for more camellias for you. It was kind of that kind of thing. But he introduced a lot of nice camellias like Gunsmoke, Jesse Burgess, if you've ever heard of these. He introduced them. His name was Bob Burgess. And his wife was Jessie Burgess. And anyhow, after Mr. Bob died, we were able to go in and get seeds from the bushes because she was going to sell the property, and we had one last time to get seeds. So we went in and got a wash tub, filled them up with seeds. And we took them to another friend's property out on Norwood Avenue, not far from where Frey is. You knew where the Sanchez lived? It was the lot next to it with the big house with the brick. Okay, just so you'll understand this and nobody else will. And on that lot, we planted all the seeds. Now, we didn't plant them the way that I'm going to tell you that I do today. Ray said, let's just dig a hole. He'd take his foot and we'd drop a seed in. I mean, went all over that whole place. We planted all these thousands of seeds. And then one day he calls me up and says, you got to come over to the house. You won't believe the seedling that I found in that place. And I'm thinking, you come over to your house and you live on Hale Street. How did you get it to Hale Street from out there? So anyway, I did. When I got there, there's this camellia that had holly leaves on it. He said he found it in the garden, so he reached down, he tried to pull it up, and he broke it off. Because when you plant them in the ground like we just did, they make tap roots, and they grow straight down, and you can't get them up. Well, he broke it off. There's no roots on it. And he says to me, you need to graft it. So here I am, you know, I go to the nursery, I find the biggest camellia I got, and I cut it off. And I took that little seedling and made 4 little tiny scions, cuttings that you graft, and I grafted, and every one of them took. So all that energy came up, and here's this holly-looking stuff. I showed it to all the camellia experts in town, and they all told me that it wasn't a camellia. Yeah, I mean, they did. They said it's not a camellia. I don't know what it is, but it's not a camellia. It's got to be a camellia. I grafted it on a camellia. No, it's not a camellia. Well, we decided that if it ever looked like anything, you know, we'd name it, you know, because it was so unusual. When it finally bloomed, we named it after my dad, Francis Eugene Phillips. And so it was not a bad flower. This is on the cover of the American Camellia Society journal right there. She passed that around.
That's not a camellia.
It's not a camellia. Well, I don't know what it is, but it looks like a camellia, but I guess it's not a camellia. So you don't never know what you're going to get. You might get something that's unusual like that. Oh, by the way, this is the foliage of Francis Eugene Phillips right up in here. And what we find interesting is that when you cross Francis Eugene Phillips and use the pollen on Francis with other varieties, and it sets seeds, almost every single time, the baby is going to have holly-like foliage in there. Like this. This is Royal Velvet times Francis Eugene Phillips. It's a seedling. And so if I wasn't busy doing programs, I'd go and pollinate some more of those plants. So anyway, you don't ever know what you're going to get. You might come up with something that's good. You might come up with something that's not so good. But if you ever plant a seed and you have a Francis Eugene Phillips in your garden, and that seed that comes from another bush has holly leaves, like we say, Daddy gets around. You think of my daddy. Yeah. And but think of it kind of, they're like children. Every one of them's going to be different. And when you grow a seedling, you don't know what it's going to do, but you get to have at least some understanding of what the plant's going to be like until it gets up. You know, I don't care if you've got the most beautiful plant in the flower in the world. If it's on an ugly plant, a plant that just dies, it gets dieback in it, it won't root, it's not really something that I'm going to be personally interested in. So that's going to be about half of the flowers that'll be in the show that you're going to see here the week before Thanksgiving. There's a lot of these retics that are going to be big, beautiful flowers, but they're not going to be great plants. So it depends on what you're doing. If you're growing them for show and that kind of thing, it doesn't matter. They're fine. But if you're growing them for a garden plant like I want to see doing, I want a plant that's a good plant, and then the flower is a nice type thing. And so I do a lot of breeding, you know, and I've got some unusual things because you don't never know what you're going to get out of it. This one is a cross of a yellow species and a tropical species called Amplexicales. It has leaves 11 inches long. And so we don't know what that's going to do, but I'll get to know this plant between now and when it shows me its first flower. When I see the flower, I'm going to already know about the plant. I mean, that's just...
How many years are we talking about from seed for the first plant?
It depends on a lot of factors, but I would say the earliest that I've ever seen a seed is 2 or 3 years, Paula. But it can be as much as 10 or 12 years if you don't do anything. And when you get to be my age, you start thinking about, well, you know, I'll get it started and somebody else will have to evaluate it. But anyway, you don't ever know. See, this is another one of the Amplexicales with the big leaves that I'm breeding back in here. Yes, ma'am.
How do you know when your seeds are ready to pick?
Ah, that's the million-dollar question. Freya, you can tell them. You said you'll come and ask me. I understand. You want to have the inside. Okay, first of all, let's talk about the seeds. I just happen to have a bag of them right here. Imagine that. On the inside of this seed pod, which is cracking, there's black. Can you see it from where you are? They're black. And if we pull it on open in here, the inside, there's 3 seeds on the inside, and they're black. If they're black or they're brown, they're probably ripe. Now, certain species are going to mature at certain times. Japonicas, for instance, which is what most of us are familiar with, most of us have. The seeds are going to likely mature, I would say, July and August. Whereas Sasanqua seeds are going to be a little bit later, like September, October, November, before they get the black. The Sinensis, the tea, is probably going to be around October. But this year, because we had a mild winter, we didn't have a freeze to damage some of the plants, and that depends on where you live. Some of them could be earlier mature. So what I would tell you is I would take the seed pod and take a knife, just like we were going to use, and just take one seed pod off of the plant and try to cut into it. And it's gotten a little hard in there. But if you can get to where you can see the seeds, and again, it's black, there's a good chance if you pulled all the seed pods that haven't cracked on your plant, they would be ready. And so what do you do with them? You put them in you can put them in a little lunch bag, a paper bag. And if you leave them in there for 3 or 4 days, they all start cracking open. So you don't have to cut into every one of them right there.
Is there a chance of doing any damage if you're not going to use it for planting?
Mm-hmm.
If you pick it at, say, in June, you see the seed pod there in June.
If you're not going to plant the seeds,
Does
no.
it matter?
You can just get rid of them. Just get rid of them. If you got any kids in the neighborhood, give them to them. They'll throw them at your house. You know, that's the big thing. You know, we used to have seed pods that you cross-pollinate, and then some little kid would come around and he thought it was a grenade. He was playing Army. You know, he'd pick it, throw it. It's not going to hurt to do that, just to get rid of it. The plant, it's using a certain amount of energy to take care of the seeds. If you pulled them off, it would just go to the plant. So there's not a problem with any of that right there. And by the way, what we just looked at, those pods, botanically they call them fruits. Yes, yeah. But I still call them the seed. Now, if you're dealing with some others, like for instance, Camellia azalea, the summer bloomer down here, it's an entirely different animal completely. It blooms here from May through September, during the summer months. And my objective is to breed it to create more ever-blooming camellias, or camellias that bloom in the fall. So I save pollen off of my winter bloomers and put it in the refrigerator or freeze it. And then in the summer, when these things bloom, I go out and pollinate them, start them. I put a tag on it, and I have a date. Because I watch those tags, because almost invariably, 2 months after you make the pollination, if you got a seed pod, it's going to be cracking open. And there are these little teeny weeny tiny seeds in there that if they fall on the ground, you'll never find them. You know, and so if you have things that are unusual, it's gonna be a little bit different. So exactly when they mature will be depending on the species, but mostly Japonicas, July and August, and Sasanquas in the fall. And that's going to be the primary things that we have right here. So we talked a little bit about collecting them. If you have a plant in your yard and you know the name, let's say you have a royal velvet in your yard and it's got a seed pod and you're going to plant it, on your labels, make a note what the mother plant was. You may not know what the father plant was unless it turns out to have holly leaves. But at least you know a little bit of what to expect. And then later when it blooms, it's kind of neat to see how different it is from the mother plant. So that would be one thing that I would say to do. Now, Daddy would sprout his seeds in a gallon jar, just like this right here. You know, anybody ever seen these glass gallon jars? I know this.
Pickle jars.
Yeah. We got these type of jars from Bob McCorkle at McCorkle's Bakery. He used to save them for us. He was a nice fellow. And I always loved going with Daddy because while Daddy was getting the jars, Miss McCorkle would take me around and get me cupcakes, you know, in the front. But he used them for grafting covers, but then he would also use them to sprout his seeds. So that brings us to, nope, not over there, here. Peat moss. All right, just regular peat moss that you get at your garden center or Lowe's, the brown peat moss. He would take and soak it in a bucket of water where it would absorb all the water, and then he would squeeze handful at the time to get every bit of excess water out. So it would be damp peat moss, not wet peat moss. Then he would come over and he'd get an empty jar, pretend there's no water in this jar, and he'd put a layer about an inch of peat moss, and he'd plant seeds, just stick them all around the edge of the jar. And he'd put another layer of peat moss, and then he'd put seeds around the jar. He'd go all the way up. He'd have jars all over the house, you know, with all those seeds. When they would sprout, he could see the little sprouts on the edge of the jar. So then he would take all the peat moss out to get them, and then he had to put it all back in. That's a lot of work, you know. That was the way Daddy did it. It's the way everybody did it back then. We don't do it quite that way. We're going to do it a little bit different. But before we get to the difference of how we do it, there's this little thing called floaters and sinkers, and that brings me to why I have the water in the jar. The old-time camellia folks are going to say that what you want to do is take the seeds out of the pod, you get a bunch of seeds, and then you throw them in water. And you let them sit there for a day or whatever. And it just so happens that I have some seeds that are out of the hulls. Now, it's another thing, if you have seeds and you don't have time to plant them, you can get a damp paper towel, put your seeds in, stick them in a Ziploc bag, and put them in your refrigerator, and they'll last up to 4 years. And if you come back in a couple of years and you haven't planted them, they probably sprouted in the refrigerator. So you got your seeds, and you throw them in the water. And it looks like they're all floating. Well, if you leave them in there for a little bit of time, eventually some of them are going to sink, and then there's some of them that are still going to float. Now, the old-time camellia people say you throw the floaters away. They're no good. Plant the sinkers. So one day I decided, I had a whole bunch of seeds, and I'd did them, and I counted them, and I put them, and we got over almost all of the sinkers to root, but to sprout, but we got half of the floaters to sprout too. So I wouldn't say that you want to do that. That's just my opinion, but that's the old time way to do it. And then there's also the thing of taking the seed, and before you plant it, of cracking it. So you can have a nutcracker, you can have a pair of pliers, you can have a little hammer. You don't want to hit it too hard, just the, and you heard that crack. And if you pull it apart, then there's a little embryo that you can see on the inside. The idea is that you want the embryo to get out, and so by cracking it, you're making it a little bit easier for the embryo to start growing. And so you could crack them, and then you could do the water test, soak them if you wanted to, and then you can plant them. So what do we do to plant them that's different from Daddy's way of doing that? Well, what I do is I use the same rooting medium that we just talked about. The half perlite and half mulch, the same thing. So if you want to root in here, that's fine, but you can also, you can germinate seeds in there. The seed that we cracked, I can come in and just make a little hole, and I'm talking about maybe half an inch, 3/4 of an inch. Drop the seed in so it's just barely covered. Keep it moist. Don't water it every day like you do your cuttings, but keep it moist, and the seeds will actually germinate in there. So these are some that we did last year. You can put more than one seed in a pot. You know, sometimes you put a lot of seeds in the pots. Like those are Chekiang oleosa seeds. Anybody grow any Chekiang oleosas at your house? You got any Chekiang oleosas? Okay, here. Yeah, I've been meaning to give you some of these anyway. Here, there you go. They're yours. It sets a lot of seeds, and they use it to make oil, but whatever. It's good root stock, Mike. It'll work for you in there. So you can plant them that way and cover them up. So I kind of like this simplified version. You root in the same soil, you plant seeds in the same soil, and you don't have to pull out all the seeds in peat moss and spend 3 hours putting them back in every jar. So I think that works out a little bit better from what I'm trying to do. You know, it doesn't matter whether or not you have a seed that you cross-pollinated, or whether it's something that nature did. The bees, the insects, that they pollinated it for you. It really doesn't make any difference. If you can't get that seedling sprouted and growing into a plant, you didn't accomplish anything. You don't have anything coming down the line. So having a technique that works like this is probably as good as any. I noticed sphagnum peat moss. Anybody know what sphagnum? Not the brown, but the kind they use in hanging baskets and stuff. I noticed on one of the Chinese websites, somehow I ended up being put in this group, you know, and I don't know. They're talking about me, but I don't really know what they're saying. But I was able to hit the translate button on a couple of things, and they have this sphagnum moss that they're putting in little Ziploc bags, and then they're sticking their seeds in there. So that's another thought of something that you might want to try as well. But whatever you get, it's going to be something that's, you know, probably interesting. Whether it's something that you want to name or not, you know, that's another story. You know, I had this one is another one of our cover flowers. This was one of my hybrids from a while back. This is called Alice B. DuPont. Anybody know that name or recognize it? Anybody ever heard of Longwood Gardens? Yes. Okay. This was named after the founder of Longwood Gardens. They had a national contest for seedlings to decide which one they would select to be named after Alice B. DuPont. It was a big thing. It's up in the conservatory. And I talked Cliff Parks into putting in his Blue Twilight seedling because it was a slam dunk. It was the great, he doesn't like to name flowers after people, but he agreed to put it in. And those people chose my seedling over his. And I only had one plant of it, and I had to give it to him. And so ever since then, I've been trying to get Alice to go, and I got a couple of little things. You know, it may be something that you come up with that will be named like an Alice B. DuPont, or it may be something that you never register the name, but it's something that you enjoy. That's the fun part of it. It's kind of like every day when you're seeing a seedling and it's showing color for the first time. I can't wait to see it. Tomorrow, is it open all the way up? That's the kind of enthusiasm that I get from doing that. So you got to have a simplistic view for rooting and a simplistic view for sprouting the seeds. And this is how I do it. You might do it a little bit different, maybe a lot different. If you find a better way, I want to know about it. So has anybody got any more questions about, okay. Yes, ma'am.
I have harvested or pulled off or whatever some seeds, and they've just been sitting like in a little bowl in my window.
How long?
A long time. Okay,
Not good.
Just throw them away. Okay, because I've got more of that bush, but I just.
Good point, what you
Didn't
brought
know.
up there is that you don't want the seeds to dry out. And so if you put them in a jar and sit them in the house, they're gonna dry out. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't eventually, some of them sprout, but it would be better if you didn't have time to plant them, that you put them in a bag and a damp paper towel and stuck them in your refrigerator and then plant them later. And so don't let them dry out. I saw another hand. Yes, ma'am.
Well, do all camellias bear seeds?
No, they don't. There are some that are gonna be what we call infertile. They're just not capable of having children, okay? And then there's gonna be some that are gonna be what we call formal doubles that just never have the parts. Yeah, I don't know how to say it any better than that, but so, and there'll be some that you'll find that'll be extremely fertile. It'll have seed pods all over, you know. And then there'll be some that have holly leaves. Yes, ma'am.
If you've got a plant that you really, really love, I've got lots of them, but that has little tiny volunteers, when you go out in the woods and you're looking at them and there's little volunteers, they've got that long taproot, you can't get them up.
It depends on whether you pull it up or whether you dig it up. Dig it
with a
up.
little hand trowel.
Yeah, keep digging,
It's
keep
in soft wood, you know, mulch
Yeah.
soil.
If you can keep digging and just don't try to pull it up and break it, you probably could save it.
I've got like dozens and dozens of volunteers underneath all of my ladyfair camellias.
Yeah. It just makes it more difficult, but yes, it can be done. I've done that before.
Try that. I mean, I got some volunteers that are like this when I'm
Yeah.
working out in the woods this winter that I found.
Yeah. So you can do it. You just, don't break it off. If you do, you gotta graft it.
Just keep digging.
Yeah. Anybody got any other questions?
Are those volunteers because the seeds have fallen off?
Yes. Seeds, there was nobody harvesting them, so they just fell off and they just naturally germinated. Sometimes they don't germinate because our little friendly squirrels and animals will get to them. They like seeds. And so, yeah. Anybody else got any questions? Well, good.
Outstanding.
That's how I do it. I appreciate y'all coming.